Hi everyone, this tutorial is just to demonstrate a few techniques if you're trying to work with curvilinear walkways. Talk about this in the studio for 414. I know a number of you are working with curved walkways, so this is just a couple techniques that utilize several different plugins in SketchUp to help you manage, particularly not just create the curved walkways, but also manage the textures. So the simplest way to approach this is to just use a series of arcs and offsets. I know there's when you're using curvilinear forms, you really want to make sure they flow together, and so you can do that with circular arcs. First thing to keep in mind and to remember to do is when you pick that arc tool, and I like to use the 2-point arc, is to actually put in the number of sides. You'll notice down here it says it defaults to 12 sides. I'm going to set this up to 40. Hit enter. And that just determines the number of segments that are created when you start drawing these arcs. And again, get yourself in the right first arc. You can't really tell where it's going. You're creating this bulge distance, but make sure you're not catching that blue axis or you're actually drawing it up into the air. So I'm going to put the first one down there, and you can tell that it's pretty smooth. If you don't have that number of segments set up high enough, then when you get down to eye level views, eventually to show what this looks like, you'll see this really strong faceting. Now, as you do a series of arcs, if you want a curvilinear, you can start from that endpoint, and SketchUp gives you this prompt, cyan prompt, to show you what's tangent. And if you just double click there, it'll lock that in. And so you can do a whole series of back-to-back curves or alternating curves that all stay tangent to each other, and it gives you that nice kind of sinuous look that you want for those kind of curvilinear forms. Okay, so if you're drawing them directly in SketchUp, that's the best way to do it. Also, when you're done with that, if you're doing a bigger walkway like the one over here on the right, you can offset that. This is kind of a key to the rest of the techniques I'm going to show you here. If you have a real organic free-form shape that varies in its width, all these techniques won't work in that particular situation in terms of mapping the textures anyway. The forms will create, if you're using concrete or some other kind of hard surface material that doesn't have a pattern in it, then that works fine. And probably for an organic shape like that is completely undulating, for example, let's just say that my other form then is going to go like this. And so if that's the shape of your form, then probably not going to use decking material. You could use a modular paving material like brick or concrete pavers, but you probably just have them going in the same continuous direction as opposed to trying to make them follow this form. So if you're creating a shape like this, then the rest of these techniques are probably not going to work perfectly well for you. But if you're going to use a standard width on the walkway, the first thing I like to do is select all these pieces, each individual arc, and there's a plugin that's just called Weld, and it simply welds these together. So now when I click on this, it selects the entire arc. That just makes it, you don't have to do that, but it makes it easier to work with. I can come down here now to my offset, and I can pull an offset off of, let's make it 10 feet. And now I've got that, and I can still explode this or break it down into the individual arcs if I need to later on. So that way I'm not limited by this, but it just makes it easier to select. All right, so I think what I'll do for the rest of the sake of this demonstration, just to make it simpler, is to take one of these segments. So I'm just going to delete that one. I'll select this, right click on it, and just choose explode curve. Now unfortunately what that does is it explodes it down into all these, it's a good illustration, all these individual pieces, which is what you really don't want it to be, because then you can't select this as one piece. So I'm just going to triple click on that and delete that. So if you're going to weld them together, make sure you're going to work with them all as one continuous line, because once you do that, you can't really go back to the original arc. So I'm just going to pick one arc here. I'll select that. Let's do an offset 10 feet. And so then if I, for this example, somebody asked a question about kind of a deck walkway, like a boardwalk with stone edges, or if you had some other kind of edging on it. So again, just simply going to use the offset tool. So if I want to go out here, maybe 1.5 feet. Okay, sorry, 1.5 foot. There we go. And if you want to create a gap in here, I would create another little offset. In other words, there's going to be a little space between the board. And if I come out this direction, maybe this is just 1 inch. So I've started creating these offsets. And then I can use my line tool to come in. And I don't want to close that gap because that's a separate material. I'll just do this side for now. So I come back over here, use the line tool, connect that. And connect that one. I won't do the close one just to keep things moving along here. So now I've got these two separate surfaces and I can group those, but since they're not touching each other right now, it's not absolutely necessary at this point. But again, I could reproduce this same edging material over on the other side if I wanted to. Now, if you're just going to fill it with a pattern, what you're going to end up getting is something that looks like this. And if I use my paint bucket, pick that up, obviously it's just going to look exactly the same. So I've got this stone edging and I've got the deck. And that's not really what I want, right? But there's no way in SketchUp's native paint bucket tool to change. I can rotate it around and I can right click on it, choose texture, position, and I can rotate it so it's this direction, but I can't get it to wrap around the curve. There's just no way to do that. But that's what we need a plugin for. However, there's one step that we need to do in order to use that plugin. We need to create this one single surface as a series of quad face surfaces. And there's another little plugin that you can get. It's called, I think these are the split tools that have split up, split donut, split sausage. And you can use that by selecting the surface, hold the shift key down, select one edge. And I want to pick this short perpendicular edge, not one of the sides, because I want it to use this as the guide to split this across. And then I just simply click on split sausage. You can see what it does. It's drawing perpendicular lines across. So now this curvilinear single surface is broken into this series of surfaces that are all have 4 corners on them. And then the next thing I want to do is just use the eraser tool with the control key down. And I'm just going to move across all of those and soften them so that they become hidden geometry. And you'll see why that's important. Okay, so the next thing I can do, and I can turn this hidden geometry back off, is how do I adjust this texture? So now I've got it broken down into quad faces. The next plugin you can use are the Frito tools. If I click on that, it's got a whole series of different ones, but the one I'm interested in is through paint. And that allows me to pick a surface, and I just changed it because that was the last material I used. So what I need to do is to come down here and say sample material. So I'm going to sample this material. I'm going to paint it onto there. So you can see it scaled it a little bit, but I'm going to show you how to fix that. Once you get the material applied, I'm going to hit the right or left arrow keys, and it'll activate this scaling function. Now, the other thing that you can see up at the top is the UV painting method. UV is just corresponding coordinates for X and Y, only in the realm of materials and textures. And the reason there's X and Y for geometry and UV for materials is that sometimes you want your texture to follow a different coordinate system than the actual geometry itself, which is what we're going to do right now. Now, this is just applying it like SketchUp's native mode. It just puts it straight down on the surface. What I want to do is switch to this type of UV painting, where now it's actually following the quad mesh UV. And that's why I had to create those quad mesh surfaces, and you can see them in red there, even though the lines aren't showing. Again, if you click on this, I can come in here and scale this in either direction, or I can rotate it, but you can see it's already kind of bent that around the curve. So what I really want to do is scale it uniformly. So I'm going to hover over this center diagonal, click on the yellow handle, and just drag that up. And you can see as I do that, it's scaling the board size up and bending it right around the edge there. Okay, and I'm not going to explain all the different settings here, but when you've got that right, you can click on this and exit. And if I want this edging to do the same thing, I have to come in and do the same thing. Select the surface, one edge, go in and do my split sausage. See, it added those in there. And then I'm going to come in with my eraser tool and hold the control key down. And just smooth those out. Now since these tutorials are all kind of leading up to eventually getting into Twinmotion, these aren't going to show up anyway, but if you want to use it in SketchUp, it's good to have them hidden. Okay, so now I've got them all hidden. I can go back to select that material, go back to my Frito tools, use through paint, click on that. Again, it's switched materials, so I'm going to use my eyedropper, pick up that one, apply it to there. And now you can see that it's bending that stone pattern around there, around that curve the same way. Again, if I want to click on that, scale it up, because maybe that wouldn't be quite as many stones in there for a cheek wall. And then once I'm done, I just click on the close, and now I've got that applied. And those textures will be maintained in that orientation when you bring this into Twinmotion. Okay, so that's the first and the simplest method. Excuse me. And I think it's important also, you'll notice in this one that I just have single line. And when you look at this in Twinmotion, it doesn't look very realistic because there's no gaps, there's no edges. So the first step in making that better is to come down here and create that gap. Now later I actually pulled this edge back in so that in Twinmotion, if you have grass or something, plants, they can't show through that gap in there. And by making it black, it highlights that offset even more. And you can see I didn't really do my job very well here. Probably if I want to make that more realistic, I should at least put a wood material or something on there so that you don't see the stone on the edge of the walkway, the decking. Now another thing you can do before I go on to the next method to really add realism to that is to round the corners. You can see how these are rounded off on the decking and on the stone itself. That's one of the things that Lumion added, which is great. And you can just pick a material and tell it to round the edges in Lumion, but Twinmotion doesn't have that feature yet. But you can do that with another plugin in SketchUp, and it's just called Round Corner. If I can find it. Where are you? There you are. These three icons right here, you can put a chamfer on there or a round corner. So what I'm going to do is first is select this surface, click on my round corner plugin, and then the first thing I want to do is come up here and decide my offset. Right now it's set at 1/4 inch, which is maybe small for that stone. So I'm going to click on that and put, just so you can see it easier, I'm going to do 1 inch. And it gives you this little preview. So you want to make sure if you've got a corner below here, you don't round it all the way down into another piece of the geometry. And if that looks good, then you just move outside and click, and there you go. It just takes that and rounds that off. So one of the things you want to make sure you do is have your textures oriented the right way. In this example here, you can see this texture hadn't been changed yet. So you want to make sure those textures are applied properly with the through paint before you start rounding corners, because then it makes it that quad face object gets changed because this is adding geometry to it. So get all that straightened out and then go in and round the corners last of all. But you can do that on the decking, and that's basically what I did on this one here, rounded over. Now, so this still is just one solid surface, right? And the only thing that makes it look like it's a boardwalk is that it has a texture that's bending around it. So that's the quickest, easiest method for representing that. And I can show you in Twinmotion. I'll move over here, zoom in on this a little bit. You can see, you know, it looks pretty good from my level view. You get a little variation in that texture. You can see the rounded corners there. And, you know, that's, as you move back in perspective, you can't really see the individual boards very well, and so forth. So it really does work pretty good. Now, in this example, you can see one of the mistakes I made on this pattern I had oriented the right way. This one was actually perpendicular to that, so I must have rotated it with the through paint. So you want to make sure that both of these are in the same orientation in SketchUp, because once you get into Twinmotion, I can't change this one without changing this one very easily. So if you make sure that's just, I think this one that I did later, this was a second round, I fixed that. So now you can see both sides of the cheek wall have the pattern oriented the right direction, and it all looks good. Because I can pick this up and substitute a different material for it if I want in Twinmotion, or let's just say I pick up this wood material. I could pull my color picker up here and I could just say, well, I really want that a little darker wood, and I can do that. I can go into my color and add some more grunge to it so it makes it look like it has some weathering. I can adjust the luminosity of it if it's too bright. So I can make those adjustments, but you want to make sure that the UV mapping of the pattern is correct in SketchUp before you bring it into Twinmotion. Okay, now let's go back and look at the next technique. I went from there and thought, okay, what if you want more realistic looking decking? Then you can go in and actually create individual boards, which in this case I rounded off and copy those around the arc. And at first in SketchUp that actually doesn't look too bad, although you see a little repetition. It almost looks like it's maybe a composite material as opposed to wood. The problem is in Twinmotion, when that comes in, those patterns are kind of highlighted even more. So you can see this repeating pattern that goes all the way around. It's really hard to see the lines between the boards. So I'm not really that happy with that as a method. That looks kind of plain. So the last method that I tried is this one here that I'm really much happier with. And it uses kind of the same approach, but with a little variation to be able to make, instead of making one board and copying it all the way along here, I did about 6 different variations. So each one's a little different color. I stretched the scale of the texture a little bit so the patterns don't line up. And I was pretty happy with it. Now in this case, this lighter board kind of stands out, but again, I can select that, click on my color tab, and just come in here and say, okay, maybe it's a little too bright. I'm just going to adjust that down so that it still blends in. And now that one board really isn't standing out. I actually can see in between the boards there, and it looks pretty realistic. And because these boards are components, I was able to actually create this cheek wall out of geometry, and I'll show you how I did that in just a second. But each of these pieces of stone is associated with the board. It's all in the same component. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see each of these is unique, and then they get copied and repeated. And you can see on the outer side, I've only done one piece, and that's all that you see repeated. And since I copied this along a line, it switches sides when it comes over to here. But I can go in and modify any one of these in SketchUp, and it updates and modifies everything else as it goes through the pattern. So, you know, from a plan view, this looks much more realistic. It's a little more work, but it really isn't that much. So I'll show you that real quick, and we'll wrap this tutorial up. Okay, so the biggest challenge in coming up with this method is to get these boards in the right configuration so that they don't overlap or get big gaps in between them. And the easiest way to do that is just by starting with a line. So I have a pair of arcs. Again, they need to be offset, kind of parallel, and I'm just going to use the line tool to connect those 2 edges. I'm going to select that line tool and use my rotate tool. And I'm just going to move out here until I can find the center of that arc. going to click. The first click is my rotation point. Then I'm going to click on the reference point, tap the control key, and I'm going to move this all the way to the end. And now that I've done that, I've got, live option to change the number. So I'm going to start with maybe 65 and a forward slash. That breaks that up into 65 segments. If they look a little big, I think maybe more like 75. Again, you could look at that. I'm trying to get them around a 2 by 6, somewhere in that size. If I go up to 90, you can see they get a little closer together there, a little smaller. So just pick a dimension that you like, and you can always erase these and do it over again. If you wanted to come in here and measure this, you could actually see how big this is. But I think I'm going to stick with that one right now. Cancel out that, and let's just check with my tape measure. So that's 6 3/8 inches. So it's around a nominal 2 by 6 size. So I think I'm going to go with that. Now I'm going to get rid of all these other lines. Just slide over them real fast with the eraser tool, and they're gone. And I'm going to fix this one here. You can see, because of the way this gap is, there's a little piece there. I'm not going to draw another line segment. I'm just going to grab that and hook that onto the edge. Get rid of that little piece there. And once I know those are all connecting, I should be able to come in here, get rid of those. And I'm using another plugin. I could start drawing over these, but I have this plugin, SU for you, Make Face, and it just makes a face on it. I'm just going to reverse that so the top face is up. And now I can double click on that and make it a component. And I'll just call this deck 1. Okay, and if I want to open that up, I can pull that up, just do 2 inches, keep it kind of at nominal size. So now I've got one component, and I can take that one and do the same process. Get my rotate tool, find the center point. All right, and in this case, I'm going to go to the end of the board here, click, tap the control key, put that at the end, and now I can go back up to my, let's do a 65 forward slash, and just come in here and kind of look at the gaps that I'm trying to create. So we're going to go 75, maybe 80, 85. A little trial and error, but that looks pretty good. And you can see it's kind of offsetting those boards, but that's a good sized gap in there. And that way I know the boards are going to fit in exactly the same size I want. Now, if you were just going to use that first method I showed you, that all these boards are the same, then you'd be done here. You could just apply a texture to them. But as I said, that method doesn't really work super well. So again, now that I've got my spacing, I'm going to come in here and delete all these except for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now what I need to go through, I have these 6, is to select, right click, and make it unique. Select this, make unique. Select this one, make it unique. Select this one, make it unique, and the last one. And just so you can see them, I'm just going to pick some colors. We use that one, that one, that one, that one, and that one. Okay, so as I said, what I do is I just applied a wood grain texture to each of these. Now that they're all unique, each one can have a different pattern. You can scale it just using the standard position texture function that I was showing you a little earlier. And as long as they're unique, you can also do that in Twinmotion. Once it comes in there, you can just swap out these colors for Twinmotion's wood patterns and use those as a way to adjust it. So whether you do that in SketchUp or Twinmotion, doesn't really matter. So now I'm going to take these 6, and I'm going to do the same thing with the rotate tool. Again, I'm going to go to the end of that board, tap Control, Snap it there. Now, since I have 6 at a time, let's try 25. Okay, so you can see they're overlapping. So 15. Okay, so that ended up being 16, and now they're just about where they're supposed to be. All right, let me zoom out so you can see it. All right, so now I've got them fit in there. Now you can try, and I've done this, you can try drawing one of these boards and taking a guess and then copying it, but it's by using the line, breaking it up, erasing those, getting the single board done, copying that, making sure you got the spacing, and then finally making them neat. So you're kind of doing it over a few times, but as you can see, it's pretty quick so that you can go through that process very quickly. And then the nice thing is, as I said, if you wanted to add an edging, because these are all separate components, I could come in here, take this side, move a copy, perpendicular, give it a little bit of a gap there, extrude that out. Now you can see it's kind of coming off to the side a little bit, so I might even just grab this one and move it over. And I'm going to come in here, let's just make that. So you can see that as I do that, it's of course adding it to each copy of that component all the way around. So if I go down here one board at a time and create a slightly different configuration, that's just going to get repeated. And at any time, if I want to edit this, I can just come back and edit those individual components, and it will update the entire length of the boardwalk. So that's basically the technique behind creating this, this version that looks like this in Twinmotion. And again, it's a little more work, but it creates, if you're going to have a lot of close-up shots of your elevated boardwalk or decking, then that's a really nice method to use. And again, the key is in SketchUp that this really has to be a uniform offset. So again, if you have a very organic or undulating form, then you're going to have to do a little more manual work. But that's several different techniques, whether you keep it simple and use a image map, and again, the higher resolution the image map is, the better it's going to look in Twinmotion. If you use a real low res decking image pattern, it's not going to look as good in Twinmotion, but hopefully that'll help you. Again, we use the split sausage to create the quad faces on there so that we could actually create these lines. That's what allows us to apply that texture around the corner. So that's super important if you're going to use the texture approach. Then we use the Frito Tools Through Paint tool to actually map the texture around the curve and to scale it to the appropriate size. We use the weld option to hook the arcs together. If you want to use multiple arcs at one time, you can do that. The key though with that is you still have to come in, and as long as they're all parallel and offset from the original side, then you can do this quad faces all the way through the length of it. But the key to using through paint is to make sure this is set up. If you have triangles in there, if they don't line up, then the through paint's not going to work. Okay, and then basically we just use SketchUp's rotate copy tool and their components in order to repeat variations of the same kind of board around the length of multiple arcs. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. If you have some questions that are specific to your unique project, I can't cover all the bases here, so drop me an email, let me know what's going on, and I'll try to answer your questions.